And John, are you there?
Yes. Yep.
Yes, John. John, I will give you just a very, very brief presentation. John would like to talk with us about how things are going in the US for soccer and Major League Soccer. Thank you, John.
Yeah. Thank you. And I'll have to speak pretty quickly, so I have to run right after this. But I'll get going, and thank you, Carlo, for inviting me. You guys can see my presentation.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so we are going to talk a little training theory, a little accentuated eccentric loading, and if I have time, I'll get to a monitoring case example. I was really honored to talk here. I mean, looking at the speaker list, it's quite humbling, and I got to thinking, like, oh my gosh, like why did Carlo, invite me to be a part of this? And I got to thinking it must have been my soccer career that obviously, like, I was not only physically dominant, but possessed a great deal of technical skill as well. And that is my tongue in cheek. I don't come from a large background in soccer, but I'll do my best to provide you guys some examples that are useful in your practice. And that will mostly be in talking about principles. I'm not going to tell you the sets, reps, or exact details of what to do. I'm a big believer in this quote that the man or woman who grasps principles can successfully select their own methods. And so the first couple that we are going to talk about here are periodization and programming. And periodization includes all of these things: optimizing performance, managing fatigue, moving from general to specific. It's timelines as well, zooming all the way out to the lifetime of an athlete on down to a single session, and then dividing that time into phases. So that's more traditionally, GPP, SPP, competition, or accumulation, transmutation, realization. Programming, however, are strategies like phase potentiation, planned overreaching, tapering, and then all of the training variables that we're really accustomed to. And I'm not going to go through an exhaustive list there for the sake of time. But the big part that I want you guys to take from this is that these two things are not the same thing, but in fact, the periodization model will drive our programming decisions. And so they have two distinct sets of goals. Periodization is number one, aimed to primarily manage fatigue, minimize injury potential for overtraining. We want to maximize adaptations to training and positively alter physiology. There we're referring to the physiological set point. So that's more adaptation oriented rather than readiness. And then thirdly, we want to maximize preparedness at a predetermined time point. The previous presentation, which was very well done, talked about preparing people for match day. That's an example of a short-term management of time, but essentially, like, we want the athletes to be at their best on match day, and periodization helps us do that. And so if we have our simple general adaptation syndrome model, you can take a 10,000 foot view of this and see where accumulation, where transmutation, where realization, and then any transitionary periods that we would have might fit into this model. But programming, with their sets of goals, again, drives the periodization model, as mentioned. And we want to provide intentional and appropriate variation in effort to properly manage fatigue. So the decisions that we make to get that person ready for match day, that is programming, though the management of that time would fall into the periodization bucket. And lastly, we want to direct training towards a desired physiological outcome within that allocated period of time. And so now if we zoom all the way in on our general adaptation syndrome model, we apply a training stimulus. There's going to be some tension, some damage, metabolic disturbance even. You can see some of the things that happen there, probably most notably substrate depletion, central nervous system fatigue, maybe some byproduct accumulation there, depending on what work you're doing. At the bottom of that pit there, we have a drop in TC ratio. Maybe we get sore, decrease in performance, probably most importantly. Through the wonders of our adaptation processes. We have an increase in protein synthetic machinery. We have all kinds of cell signaling cascades. Testosterone starts to come back. mTOR hopefully gets activated if we're doing things right from a recovery and nutrition standpoint. And then we have these very specific actions happening, dendritic branching, phenotype transitions, basically help us not only perform better, like you see here, but also be better equipped to handle the subsequent stresses. And then if we don't handle that properly, we have involution, overtraining, non-functional overreaching, all of those things. Essentially, a really unique response. The effect of our training over here on the far right is the adaptation effect. That's different from the actual physiological adaptation, which is why you see training responses being relatively predictable qualitatively, but rarely, if ever, quantitatively. The only direct cause and effect relationship that exists along this cascade is in that solid green arrow there that you see between cell signaling and adaptation. Because we're dealing with a very complex system, the effect of that adaptation does not necessarily take on the same look, which brings up the importance of having a robust athlete monitoring protocol that essentially helps us bring all these models that we've talked about. The one that we used for the sake of this presentation was the gas model, but athlete monitoring helps us bring those models to life and make decisions regarding the athlete that is in front of us. And so the general question that I am posing now as we transition to a discussion on accentuated eccentric loading is, do advanced athletes require advanced programming tactics? And you have the old adage with Milo and everything, but really what we're talking about is evolution. It's the evolution of concepts and their application, not necessarily new concepts. And that's where we bring our periodization and programming model here. Our conversation from here on out is going to be rooted in programming. And in particular, we are going to be talking about phasic loading. And so we turn our attention to soccer and phasic loading and discuss briefly the importance of eccentric action in soccer. And this is going to be very reductionist, but hopefully useful. So we have eccentric muscle actions. The mechanical muscle functions pretty much fall into two distinct buckets, either shock absorption or acting as an elastic spring. The energy conversion there, obviously, when we are absorbing, that's going to be mostly dissipated as heat. But when we use those eccentric actions as an elastic spring, we have a recovery of that mechanical energy. Essentially, we have this spectrum of now time where pure absorption would be on the far left, and then fast stretch shortening cycle actions, which for the sake of this, I'm bucketing as less than 250 milliseconds of ground contact. That would be in fast stretch shortening cycle. And some examples, all in green, are ones that you would really see in soccer. So not that it doesn't happen that you would have no concentric phase or just land and absorb in soccer, but it's pretty rare. And so you can see kind of some of the examples that in that 1 to 3 seconds, maybe the backswing phase of ball striking on through to maybe some technical ball skills, but certainly high speed running on the fast stretch shortening cycle, and then some pieces of performance that fit in that middle ground. But essentially what we are trying to do with accentuated eccentric loading, or really any eccentric training method, is exploit this eccentric force reserve, which is basically we are stronger eccentrically than we are concentrically. And the cool part about this is it's trainable. So we've leaned on that quite heavily from the eccentric only literature. But what we see from that is that, there is there are a myriad of favorable tissue adaptations, but if we go eccentric only, that means that we no longer have that paired eccentric concentric action. So we might be limited to only tissue changes and not necessarily able to drive any transfer of training effects, which may not be a bad thing, but it's a point that we should consider. And that makes accentuated eccentric loading an interesting tactic to explore, essentially, because we may get the best of both worlds. We may get favorable tissue adaptations plus some transfer of training effects, which brings us to maybe where I should have started, which is defining accentuated eccentric loading. I was fortunate enough to provide that definition for the first time, surprisingly, in like 2017, I think is when this paper came out. But we actually defined AEL as prescribing eccentric loads in excess of the concentric prescription of movements that require coupled eccentric and concentric action while creating minimal interruption to the natural mechanics of the selected exercise. And so there were three main parts right there that are highlighted in green that we can see come to life with this example that happens to use weight releasers on a back squat. But you can see the eccentric load is greater than the concentric load, quite literally. There is a coupled eccentric and concentric action. And then there are minimal interruptions to the natural mechanics of that back squat. I could even probably cover up the ends of that barbell, and you wouldn't even know that there were weight releasers attached. There are other loading applications. You can see dumbbells being applied to a plyometric there in this still image. There's also manual removal by coaches, but that requires quite a bit of staff. There is some custom machinery, but again, it's expensive, and you have to dedicate part of your weight room to it. And then you can do some band resistance. Mostly the application goes into like drop jump training and things like that. But there are certainly other things besides weight releasers, which at this point we usually get like a ton of questions when I'm presenting live. Well, what about flywheel? Flywheel is a great tool. However, if we think back to our three criteria here, the eccentric load greater than the concentric load. So the resistance that is imparted by the flywheel device is dependent on the mass of the disc, the radius of the disc, and the angular acceleration of that disc. So the inertia experienced is both parts absolute and relative. And there are several papers that have suggested that eccentric overload is not necessarily present using flywheel because of some of those relative factors. And that includes some unpublished data that I have collected. And so eccentric overload is possible. But even if we look at it in the most literal sense, the wheel itself does not change from eccentric phase to concentric phase. So the absolute loading is identical. It does have a coupled eccentric and concentric action, and I would argue too that there are greater than minimal interruptions to the natural mechanics of whatever movement that you're doing, particularly squatting. It seems to change it quite a bit. Nonetheless, it is essentially a braking force overload, which has provided us a ton of evidence that flywheel improves a variety of athletic actions, change directions, sprinting, jumping, you name it. It's also a great tool for the treatment and risk reduction of tendinopathies. And it's extremely useful in return to play processes and injury risk reduction strategies for lower extremity soft tissue injuries. So I am very pro flywheel. I use it quite often with my athletes, but accentuated eccentric loading and flywheel, I would contend, are two different things. But anyway, now back to our regularly scheduled programming here, and why should soccer care about AEL? So number one, we are going to not talk an exhaustive list of what AEL can do. I narrowed it only to the ones that I thought would be useful for you guys. And so number one is that it supports conditioning. There are very unique glycolytic adaptations observed using accentuated eccentric loading in a chronic sense. The highest overloads acutely, though, do elicit the highest lactate concentrations, which is pretty logical. But chronically, we see these changes in lactate clearance ability and an upregulation of LDHA mRNA expression, which kind of makes sense then of why we would see greater lactate clearance abilities following chronic exposure. And so we can essentially use, with a sport like soccer that has such a high work capacity demand and does require a great deal of buffering due to the intermittent efforts of that sport, we can make a pretty strong case to use this as a strategy in our resistance training. We also might see an introduction to higher eccentric rates of force development. This is from my dissertation work that you can see. This is actually on the third repetition that there was still a large effect difference in eccentric rate of force development from even overloading just the first rep. So what we did a set of 5 back squats with weight releasers like you saw in that video. the first repetition only had the weight releaser on it. Then reps 2, 3, 4, and 5 were just normal repetitions, but the eccentric rate of force development remained elevated in the second and third reps. So even without weight releasers, higher eccentric rate of force development may be advantageous to us as we develop some physical prerequisites for linear speed, for jumping, for change of direction, and all the like. Essentially, by giving the athlete that exposure in training, they can take that out to the pitch and perform better in those types of athletic actions. But we have to be very careful. A recent paper from Douglas and his colleagues, a really good paper. They did fast and slow AEL. So slow AEL elicited favorable changes in strength, power, sprint speed, performance, but fast AEL. So they did slow and then fast, so back-to-back training blocks. The fast AEL didn't cause really any additional change in any of those performance parameters, and actually may have even made the athletes slower. And these were rugby players. So we have to ask the question, do team field sports athletes not respond very well to rapid eccentric actions, or are they more susceptible to eccentric related fatigue? And though that's quite the leap to make, in my opinion, because I think we might have a little bit of just oversaturation of a training stimulus, but there is my Dr. Evil meme down there that maybe there's just a little bit going on there, but that would actually maybe be all the more reason to incorporate this into training if they are that sensitive to fatigue and to muscular damage following rapid eccentric actions. We also see an elevated growth hormone response, and this one gets tricky from a practical application standpoint to time this up. But nonetheless, you see a pretty substantial growth hormone response up to 60 minutes following accentuated eccentric loading rather than traditional loading, which is theoretically favorable when we think about what growth hormone does in general when tissues are essentially bathed in it. So we see increased mRNA translation, promotion of protein synthesis by the ribosomes. Like, are we going to help out our recovery processes from that standpoint? Are we even going to spare proteins? So there's oftentimes a reduced protein degradation in the presence of growth hormone, and growth hormone gets the moniker of being a protein sparer quite often. And then we also see situations of improved glycogen replenishment under high growth hormone responses. And so essentially what you could maybe construct here is an argument for accentuated eccentric loading as a way to just create a more robust and more recoverable athlete. But I would have to lean pretty heavily on the practitioner there to see about what the timing is like there. But one that's not listed too is that under conditions of high growth hormone as well, glycogen use tends to be downregulated, and so therefore we have a reduced carbohydrate oxidation altogether. So we might have a situation where we just can spare some of that stored muscular energy altogether. And lastly, and this is really a pairing of chronic exposure plus my dissertation, where we only had to overload a single repetition in order to elicit some acute responses that were very interesting. But accentuated eccentric loading is more economical than people give it credit for and has a very high return on investment. Chronic studies have elicited some really interesting changes in strength, power, performance, including some of those that you see here: increased voluntary muscle activation, some very unique upregulations of anabolic cell signaling factors, androgen receptor content, IGF-1, myogenic regulatory factors, even 2x specific myosin heavy chain isoform shifts, and fast fiber specific cross-sectional area changes, and not to mention the work capacity related or bioenergetic related elements that we've discussed earlier. And that logically has been accompanied by greater increases in strength compared to traditional loading and greater increases in explosive performance like countermovement jumps and sprinting compared to traditional loading. And I am doing well on time, so I'll go right to my bonus slides where I provided a brief case example. I've maybe gone even too fast, but that's okay because I know we're all crunched for time today. But this case example, this athlete is a bobsled athlete, so not a soccer player. I'm sorry. But this bobsled athlete went through a training process that essentially was structured like you see here and had a large speed development curriculum that went alongside the resistance training. So this is the basic phase potentiation model that you would see presented by maybe Dr. Mike Stone. And the track side of it, the sprinting side of it, was a short to long, popularized by Charlie Francis and those. But this athlete was coached by Dr. Brad DeWeese, so he has kind of blended these two concepts. And you can see a general overview of our monitoring system, where we had some body composition, segment girth, we had ultrasonography, we did vastus lateralis measurements, and jump characteristics, and then the isometric mid-thigh pull. We are going to talk about the progressively loaded jumps, and you can get a ton of stuff from progressively loaded jumps. We did 0 and 20 kilos. We are going to focus mostly here on the movement characteristics piece and how those changed with exposure to accentuated eccentric loading. And so a brief pause here on bimodal force time curves. So this is just basic counter movement jump. Essentially, the bimodal force time curve is referring to the two peaks. One occurs at force at zero velocity. The next would generally occur at force at peak power. And some recent work from Kennedy and Drake has contended that these bimodal force time curves use movement strategies that take longer. They have a greater braking center of mass displacement. So it basically means they don't have as much displacement left to dedicate towards propulsion. We also have a lower overall force value, so that force at zero velocity is depressed typically. And we have a greater braking minimum velocity, and probably most importantly, an inefficient stretch shortening cycle. And that stretch shortening cycle essentially becomes inefficient, I believe, or I hypothesize, because of that large amount of time between the end of the eccentric phase and the beginning, or in the end of the concentric phase. And so if we look at this piece by piece now with this particular athlete in our case study, you can see that one of these curves relates to the 0 kilo counter movement jump, and the other one is the 20 kilo counter movement jump. But essentially, because we were talking about accentuated eccentric loading here, the block following AEL had a really large spike in force at zero velocity, which we can think of that as like an eccentric peak force or a peak braking force even. This also corresponds with an increase in fascicle length on our ultrasound and an increase in sprint volume. So that sprint volume could have contributed to this as well, but nonetheless, we see some interesting muscle geometry changes as well as force production capabilities within our jump. At that same time, with force at peak power now, so that's that second circle that we saw in the bimodal figure, following accentuated eccentric loading, we had a really large drop, probably a fatigue-induced stretch shortening cycle inefficiency. But nonetheless, after we removed AEL as a stimulus and provided proper workload management to allow this athlete to recover, the efficiency returned, while, if we recall from here, the eccentric force production capabilities remained elevated well above baseline. And so then we said, okay, well, does this mean anything for performance? And following accentuated eccentric loading, similar to force at peak power, RSI mod, which is fatigue sensitive, was very low compared to what this athlete typically performed at. But again, recall this is at the time where the force at zero velocity was at its highest. And so there might be some delayed effects of eccentric utilization. Essentially, the eccentric kinetic changes preceded the eccentric kinematic changes, and there was a delayed effect on the abilities to improve stretch shortening cycle efficiency. And so if we let that supercompensation happen following some proper workload structures to allow that recovery, we saw jump height personal records the eccentric duration in both the weighted and unweighted conditions shortened quite drastically, and we still had that elevated force production to begin our concentric phase. And so, with that, now I will go back to my thank you slide, because that is where I'll conclude today. And this is something that's important to me, so I will take the 1 minute to do it. I am very, very appreciative of my mentors, of the people that I get to work alongside every day, and the people that have invested in me. So every single talk that I give, I will conclude with this and express a great deal of gratitude for all those that have invested in me. And thank you, Carlo, and everybody else involved with this event for inviting me. I hope everyone enjoyed it and thought it was useful.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John. It was a very precise and clear speech, very useful for people working both in research and also on the field.